Insellmilkom, Sinjuri, grazzi li qed issegwu il-programm. Illum se nagħtu ħarsa lejn is-sitwazzjoni li jinħalqet fl-Afganistan. Se nagħtu ħarsa lejn l-istorja moderna tal-Afganistan. Fis-sena 1926 ġie iffurmat il-pajjiż tal-Afganistan u fis-sena 1933 ir-Re Mohammed Zahir Shah beda jmexxi il-pajjiż fl-età ta' 17-il sena wara li missieru ġie assassinat. Għamel żjara statali fl-Istati Uniti fis-sena 1963 u oħra fir-Renju Unit fis-sena 1972. Fis-sena 1973 spiċċa ir-renju ta' Mohammed Zahir Shah meta l-eks Prim Ministru Mohammed Daoud Khan li kien kuġin tar-re sar l-ewwel President tal-Afganistan. Il-President Khan u l-membri tal-familja tiegħu ġew assassinati fis-sena 1978 imma ma kienx qabel l-2009 li ingħata funeral statali wara li l-katavri tagħhom insabu f'żewġ qobra barra il-belt ta' Kabul. Il-grupp muħaġġadin ġie iffurmat fl-istess sena u ġurnalist komunista li kien jismu Nur Mohammed Tariki sar president imma ġie assassinat sena wara fil-1979. Ir-riċerkaturi li sas-sena 1982 il-fuq minn 5 miljun nies Afgani kienu ħarbu mill-pajjiż bħala refuġjati politiċi. Fis-sena 1988 Osama bin Laden ifforma Al-Qaida biex ikun jista' jkompli l-gwerra tal-ġihad u xerret il-kelma li r-rebħa tal-gwerra bejn l-Afganistan u l-Unjoni Sovjetika kienet bis-saħħa tiegħu. Huwa baqa' jgħix fl-Afganistan. Fis-sena 1992 il-muħaġġadin iffurmaw ir-Repubblika Iżlamika tal-Afganistan u fis-sena 1995 it-Taliban telgħu fil-poter. Is-sena 2005 timmarka l-ewwel elezzjoni f'30 sena. Fis-sena 2017 it-Taliban iffurmaw ftehim biex isir irtirar ta' truppi tal-Istati Uniti sa' Mejju ta' din is-sena. Wara l-irtirar ta' dawn it-truppi mill-Afganistan, it-Taliban ħadu f'idejhom il-belt ta' Kabul. Ġimagħtej ilu waqa' il-gvern tal-Afganistan u l-President Ashraf Ghani ħarab mill-pajjiż lejn l-Emirati. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Edwards.
My pleasure.
Can you tell us what your experience has been with Afghanistan?
I'm an anthropologist and a professor at Williams College in the U.S. I first went to Afghanistan in 1975. I was an English teacher. That was a period when Afghanistan was at peace. So I had the good fortune of being able to experience the country before the onset of war, which really began in the late 1970s.
Il-Professur David Edwards huwa professur tal-antropoloġija u meqjus bħala wieħed mill-aqwa speċjalisti fuq il-pajjiż Afgani fejn kien jgħix u ilu jistudja għal 40 sena. Kiteb 3 kotba, wieħed minnhom li kiseb premijiet u onuri internazzjonali dwar il-kriżi fil-Afganistan. Il-Professur Edwards kien responsabbli biex jgħallem il-ġurnalisti Afgani kif jirrapportaw l-aħbarijiet u jagħmlu dokumentarji dwar id-ġrajiet kurrenti.
My first experience was 2 years in the 70s, after which I went to graduate school with the idea of returning to Afghanistan. By the end of my first year in graduate school, the Soviet invasion had happened. So I shifted my emphasis to the Mujahideen parties that were developing in Pakistan over the border from Afghanistan. I spent 2.5 years studying the movements of the different political parties associated with the Mujahideen that were fighting against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. After that, I visited Afghanistan a number of times in the 1990s and then after 2001. So altogether, I've been studying Afghanistan for more than 40 years. And at this point, I've written 3 books on Afghanistan and I also directed a documentary film that was shot in 2003.
Tell me a bit about the books you've written.
As an anthropologist, I'm interested in the kind of from the ground up. I think a lot of political scientists tend to look at a place like Afghanistan in terms of the political decision makers in the capital. I'm interested as an anthropologist in local tribal society, in particular, the tribal aspects of Afghan society and the relationship between the ideology or the ethos of honor and shame that's of central importance, particularly to the Pashtun tribes that reside along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And between that tribal ideology and the importance of Islam, and also the efforts of the government to instill a sense of national identity in the country. So all of my work has really been around the relationship between these 3 different, what you might call moral codes: the moral code of honor, the moral code of Islam, and the moral code of governance, and how those have played out historically up until the present.
Il-Professur Edwards ikellimna dwar l-aħħar ktieb tiegħu li ġie ppubblikat fis-sena 2017 fejn il-fok huwa l-oriġini tal-bombi suwiċidi fl-Afganistan.
My most recent book was a book called Caravan of Martyrs: Sacrifice and Suicide Bombing in Afghanistan. And the focus of that most recent book, which was published in 2017, was to try to explain the origins of suicide bombing in Afghanistan. When I first went to Afghanistan, and all through most of the period of time that I've worked there and have known and been closely associated with Afghans, the notion that someone would strap a suicide belt onto their bodies and blow themselves up would have been something unthinkable. So the question I posed in that book was, where does this happen? How did it happen that Afghans, at least some group of Afghans, were willing to embrace a belief that it would be better for them to blow themselves up than to continue living in the world as we know it.
Din il-ġimgħa aktar minn 90 persuna ġew ikkonfermati mejta u mill-inqas 150 sfaw midruba wara li kien hemm 2 attakki tal-bombi fl-ajruport ta' Kabul immirati lejn nies iddisprati biex jaħarbu mill-pajjiż wara il-kontroll tat-Taliban. Fost id-90 vittma kien hemm nies ċivili u 13 il-soldat Amerikan. Can we speak a bit about the current situation? What has brought this to a head? Did you have a foresight of what's going to happen?
Let's start with 2001 and some of the decisions that were made shortly after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the US, and the decisions that American policymakers made with regard to how to handle the occupation of Afghanistan. I think that a first thing to note is that the Taliban collapsed in 2001 and 2002 much more quickly than anybody anticipated. And I think that in some respects was unfortunate in the sense that it gave the American government a sense that the Taliban was not a force to be reckoned with, that they were not a significant military force. They didn't have lots of assets, lots of weapons, and they disappeared very quickly when the bombing began in October of 2001. And I say that's unfortunate because I think it led the Bush administration that was in charge then to come to the conclusion that basically Afghanistan was a done deal, that all we had to do now was kind of clean up the mess a little bit, find bin Laden, eliminate the cells of al-Qaeda that were still operating in Afghanistan. And I think that we underestimated the difficulty of the task ahead, both the extent to which Afghanistan was devastated by, at that point, 20 years of war, and the extent to which if we wanted to effectively mount a counterterrorism operation in Afghanistan, that we had to have a government, an operational government, to assist us in that effort. But instead, I think the Bush administration underestimated the task. But within 2 years, they repurposed or redeployed our a military force to Iraq, and basically for a critical 3-year period, Afghanistan was underemphasized and under-resourced. So I think that was a first important mistake that the U.S. made that allowed the Taliban to regroup and to refocus and to, in a sense, reinvent itself in the wake of its defeat in 2001, 2002. A second problem is that and this goes back even to the period of the Soviet occupation, Americans have always relied on Pakistan to call the shots. So back when we were supporting the various political parties that were fighting against the Soviets, we allowed the Pakistanis to decide to whom our weapons and our funding would go. And the Pakistanis chose the most militant Islamist groups that were then operating among the different political parties, Afghan political parties, that were all vying for influence and leverage and power in Pakistan so that they could carry on their war against the Soviets. The Americans essentially allowed the Pakistanis to decide who our assistance would go to. And we also did not develop our own separate intelligence operation, so that we were always blind and dependent on Pakistan to tell us what was happening, who were the real movers and shakers in Afghanistan, who were the people that we needed to trust and to work with. And so that happened back in the 1980s, but I think the legacy of those decisions affected what happened late in the wake of 9/11, when the Americans suddenly found themselves as the occupying force in Afghanistan. I think intelligence-wise, they didn't really know who to turn to. And they were naive about the nature of Afghan society. They had very little information about individual Afghan leaders or the different dynamics with tribes and non-tribal groups within Afghanistan. And in the wake of that, one of the decisions that was made was that the U.S. turned to warlords, people, the commanders who were already on the ground, people that had been deposed from power by the Taliban when they came to power in the late 1990s. Now, the Taliban, when they came to power, one thing that they did that was good was that they got rid of a lot of these warlords who were ravaging the countryside and exacting taxes and various kinds of oppression on the Afghan people. The Taliban, one thing they did that was very positive was that they put these people in their place. They got rid of them, forced many of them into exile. Well, the Americans, not knowing any better, in many cases gave power right back to those very people. And in the wake of that, particularly given the amount of aid, the amount of money that was flooding into this impoverished country, those warlords became fat with corruption. Many of them established homes in the Emirates and Dubai, and they were siphoning off funds from the American redevelopment effort in the country and the military effort for their own well-being, for their own corrupt purposes. So again, this is another thing that happened in the wake of 9/11 that had a detrimental impact on everything that's happened since then.
What are your comments about the president in exile in the Emirates now?
President Ashraf Ghani is himself an anthropologist like myself. So I don't know him well, but I've had, I was with him at conferences going back into the 1970s and early 1980s. So I've known him a long time. And he's, first of all, brilliant. He's an extremely intelligent man. But in some ways, I think he's too intelligent for his own good. He has a tendency to want to be the smartest person in the room. And in that effort, he tends to denigrate and downgrade the intelligence of other people. And with that, I think as well, goes a tendency not to listen very well, to micromanage, to try to be involved in every decision, not to trust any but a small cohort of people around him. And this has been a problem that Afghan rulers have had going back as far as we have historical records. The tendency that they become isolated in their courts within a small group of courtiers, of advisors, who tell them what they think the ruler wants to hear, and who basically isolate him from the reality that's going on in the world around him. And I think that was one of the problems that happened with Ghani, that he became isolated in his own palace and never really reckoned with the extent to which the Taliban advance was moving, how fast it was moving, how quickly decisions had to be made. Now, having noted that, I think it's also important to say that I think that another of the big mistakes that the Americans made was that they undercut Ghani. I don't think he was an effective president, but he was made all the more ineffective by the fact that under the Trump administration, the US government decided to hold peace talks in Doha that didn't include the Afghan government. That effectively sent a message to the government and to the Afghan people that the Ghani administration was powerless, that they were impotent, and their time in power was limited. So I think that was an important mistake that was made that really undercut the ability of Ghani to effectively act when action was still possible.
What about the allegations of corruption under his regime?
I think that the accusations of corruption were true. I can't say with any certainty the extent of that corruption, but I think it permeated Afghan society at every level. So at the very top, you had these warlords I mentioned previously who were siphoning off money and putting it into their bank accounts in Dubai and elsewhere, building luxurious homes for themselves in the elite residential areas of Kabul, but also overseas in the Emirates. But you also found that corruption at the top seeped down to the very bottom. So you would also find corruption at every level of the government administration. And I think that this was one of the reasons people talk about the collapse of the military, and they cite the failure of the Afghan army to mount a defense against the Taliban in the preceding few weeks when they so quickly the military evaporated. And I think that it's important to recognize that they were a demoralized force, and they were demoralized in large part because of the corruption that they were seeing around them, the lack of support that they were receiving. Many of the army, the lower level army recruits, many of whom didn't want to be in the army in the first place, but they also received irregular paychecks. And at the same time, they saw officials around them reaping the rewards of corrupt bribes and extracting money from the local citizens. So when it came time to mount a defense in support of the government, I think a lot of both the people themselves, the citizens of Afghanistan, as well as the military units, questioned why should they support this regime that had, for the previous 20 years, had been largely concerned with feathering their own nests and gaining their own advantage and greedily corrupting the whole processes of government. Why should we stand up for a government like that? And I think that demoralization was an important factor in why the army collapsed as quickly as it did.
In-nies tal-Afganistan kienu diġà qed jiffaċċjaw nuqqas tal-ikel u bżonnijiet bażiċi permezz tal-COVID-19. Issa qed jisofru aktar ġuħ, sitwazzjoni iddisprata mingħajr futur għal ġenerazzjoni żagħżugħa u t-tfal. L-ifriżar ta' $9 biljun Amerikani ta' riservi barranin hemm nuqqas akbar ta' importazzjonijiet ġol-pajjiż. Din il-ġimgħa ġie maħtur gvernatur ġdid tal-Bank Ċentrali mit-Taliban. L-irtirar f'daqqa ta' truppi Amerikani ħolqot kriżi globali. Mal-ewwel daqqatajn is-sitwazzjoni fl-Afganistan forsi ma tidhirx li għandha xi implikazzjonijiet kbar fuq l-ekonomija globali jew l-iswieq tal-isħma. Imma il-popolarità tal-President Biden diġà waqgħet sew u għalhekk dan ikollu effett negattiv fuq iċ-ċansijiet tiegħu fl-elezzjonijiet tan-nofs it-terminu f'Novembru. Ħafna Amerikani jemmnu li t-truppi Amerikani fl-Afganistan forsi kienu ħela ta' flus u ħela ta' ħajjiet. U s-sitwazzjoni qed tiġi imqabbla mad-diżastru fil-Vjetnam. Il-President Biden huwa meqjus bħala bniedem sew, iżda ineffettiv u din il-perċezzjoni mhijiex tajba kemm għall-ekonomija globali u lanqas għas-swieq finanzjarji. Għal darb'oħra il-poplu Afgani qed jiffaċċja kriżi umanitarja. X'inhi r-reazzjoni tiegħek dwar l-istorja komplessa ta' tbatija ta' dan il-pajjiż? Ibbatilna il-kummenti tiegħek. Grazzi Sinjuri li segwejtu il-programm illum fej tajna ħarsa lejn is-sitwazzjoni ġo l-Afganistan. Jekk għandkom xi kummenti ibbatuhom fuq in-numru li jidher fuq l-iskrin. Insellmilkom jiena Hogg għal Net TV.